So the video before this was talking about individual differences and how certain factors around the situation might make people more or less likely to be aggressive. We're going to go ahead and learn about two other factors that can have an impact on aggressive behavior, which involves learning and attributions. So let's go ahead and talk about how aggression can be learned. As we're going through this, it's important to just keep in mind that aggression is a very complicated process that involves all sorts of different potential factors at work, and learning is just one of them. So Alfred Bandura developed social learning theory as a way to explore how children develop aggressive behavior. And one of the things that he wanted to especially explore is how children model aggressive behavior through observation of authority figures and adults, and whether those adults are rewarded or punished through a sort of vicarious reinforcement. So according to Bandura, people acquire, instigate, and maintain aggression through social reinforcement and rewards and punishments. Those rewards and punishments can come by observing family members and their behavior, or by being rewarded and punished by those family members for behaving in a certain way, by consuming media and determining whether the people in the media you consume who engage in aggression are rewarded for that aggression or punished for it, as well as, once again, general information from the environment about how acceptable aggression is and the circumstances under which it is acceptable. So you can think of this as a basic conditioning and modeling approach, where you're observing someone else and then you're modeling that particular behavior if you perceive that it is acceptable to do, largely because that authority figure that you observe might not be punished for engaging in that particular behavior, implying that it is acceptable. So I have gone ahead and linked you to a video that goes through the Bobo doll experiment, which is the classic version of this, where Bandura was exploring how children observing an authority figure engaging in novel aggressive behavior towards a doll would be likely to exhibit that themselves, and would be much more likely to be aggressive when given the opportunity, compared to children who were not exposed to this particular condition. So you can go ahead and watch that video if you'd like. So that brings us to the next logical step, which is how exposure to violence in the media can actually have an impact on aggressive tendencies. Now, once again, it's important to be even-handed here. Taking a look at an aggressive film will not immediately send someone into a murderous rage. It tends to be an accumulation of many different factors, and it can be very complicated. Some people can be more strongly impacted by exposure to aggression than others when it comes to this sort of thing. But we have studied how exposure to certain forms of aggression can be more likely to increase aggression in the observer. So, for example, research shows that when an individual watches a television show where the act of violence is perceived to be an act of revenge, or one that is morally justified, that tends to increase their own aggressive tendencies and subsequent behaviors. You can think of this as almost like permission giving. So if somebody sees a clip from a television show where someone is righting a wrong, then they feel as if it is acceptable for them to behave in an aggressive way. Whereas if the part of the clip that contextualizes the aggression is cut, and you just see the aggressive behavior, they don't necessarily feel justified in the same sort of way to behave aggressively themselves. There is a correlation between violent television and viewers' aggressiveness. This is a little chicken and egg sometimes, though, because sometimes more aggressive children are drawn to more violent television. It tends to be a bit of a vicious cycle. The strength of this association tends to increase with age. And it's thought that the highest danger is children who are already prone to aggression. Basically, by showing children who are already aggressive stimuli, that tends to be more likely to increase their aggression. We used to think of aggression as being part of a catharsis model. If you saw other people engage in aggression, that would relieve your own aggressive drive. But what we now know is that it's like adding fuel to the fire, and that if somebody already has an aggressive spark, you don't want to add lighter fluid to it. That's one way of thinking about it. And once again, when children who are already prone to aggression see aggressive acts, that can be a form of permission giving, especially if they perceive the aggression that other people are engaging in that they observe to be heroic. Exposure to extraordinarily high violence for a long time will be aversive to just about any kid, though. So even children who are otherwise fairly mild, when exposed to extraordinarily graphic violence over a long period of time, tend to have a great deal of desensitization to that violence and tend to be much more likely to act in aggressive ways, regardless of whether they might have had a natural aggressive tendency or not. Research also shows that the consumption of violent pornography tends to be related to perceived acceptance of violence against women, as well as increased aggressive behavior towards women in subsequent tasks. So, for example, participants were shown either an aggressive erotic film, where acts of aggression were a part of the film, an erotic film that did not have aggressive content, or a neutral film, and then were exposed to either female or male learners in a Milgram paradigm where they could give them shocks. And what the researchers found is that the participants were more likely to give more intense shocks to the female learner when they had seen the aggressive erotic film first, indicating once again that association that can be made by seeing aggressive acts and then connecting it with the victim of that particular aggressive act and the victim that you might be exposed to in a subsequent behavioral paradigm. Another consequence of viewing acts of aggression is that of desensitization. So people who see multiple acts of violence experience less physiological arousal with each subsequent act that they observe. This is thought to be protective from a physiological standpoint. If you react with the same degree of intensity each time you see something that might be horrific or violent against someone else, then that's really hard. It's really hard psychologically, it's really hard physically. And so people will react less, they'll become desensitized towards things if they see it a whole bunch, all in a row. But it can also lead to a sense of indifference. So for example, research has shown that when people are shown a very, very violent film or a film that shows deep interpersonal violence towards other people, that the people after they see the film are more likely to indicate that they are accepting of aggression as a way to solve problems, and they express less sympathy for victims of violent crime. So exposure to a lot of aggression, especially very realistic depictions of interpersonal aggression, can have some sort of impact on the way that we perceive aggression elsewhere. So we need to get a lot better at tracking how children are exposed to media today and how things like YouTube exposure and streaming services might change how often children are exposed to violence. That being said, there's a whole series of stories about how children could be exposed to very random films that people had created through algorithms that depicted, for example, cartoon figures doing things that were harmful, and they could access those videos fairly easily through just autoplay. So this is about television, and this is about the 90s, and we don't have more current data about how often children are exposed to acts of violence through the media that they are currently consuming. But in the 1990s, an average 12-year-old witnessed 200,000 acts of violence on television. About 61% of television programs contained violence, and the majority of that violence was considered to be unrepentant and unpunished, so that the person who committed the violent act didn't get caught and wasn't sorry for it. In fact, about 40% of the violent acts were performed by people who were supposed to be the good guys, the heroes, the protagonists in the story, the people we were supposed to be rooting for. It's very interesting to note that as a culture we do tend to censure sexuality and provide it with a much higher rating than we do acts of violence. Yeah, I'm going to link, if you're interested, to a film called This Film Is Not Yet Rated, which is about the rating system that we use in order to give films a PG-13 versus R rating, and the sorts of decisions that go into that and by whom. And it might be really interesting for you to explore if you are curious about media and the sorts of media we consume and how that can be shaped by a very interesting and very shadowy body of people. Once again, it's important to think about how new media might impact exposure differently or in unexpected ways, so that very young children could be unintentionally exposed to YouTube videos that are not appropriate at all, and what sort of impact that could have on them and how often it happens. It's something we aren't as good at tracking, and I'd be interested in seeing that. The last thing we're going to talk about when it comes to the factors that can contribute to aggression involve attributions. So, for example, when we talk about attributions, we're talking about the decisions that people make about the underlying reasons why someone did what they did. When it comes to aggression, we often have to determine whether a given harm was intended to be harmful or not. So someone bumped into me. Did they mean to be threatening to me, or was it an accident? So when we're determining the perceived cause of the harm, if we determine that the harm was intentional, we perceive the harmer to be malevolent. There's also the notion of preventability. Were there other potential options? Did that car run into you because another car bumped into them and they didn't have anywhere else they could have gone? Or could they have avoided hitting you by turning the wheel at the right time, and you perceive them as being responsible because they didn't take their alternative option? If we perceive harm towards us as both intentional and preventable, we tend to be far angrier and far more aggressive. So perception really does matter when it comes to whether we will have an aggressive response. One of the things I'm very curious about is whether we are likely to attribute blame, which is another indication of whether we are likely to become more aggressive. And I specifically study this sometimes in the context of jealousy. So jealousy is a highly emotionally charged circumstance. It's one of the top 3 reasons why people commit homicide. And it also is often a source of domestic violence. So jealousy and aggression tend to be linked fairly closely. And one of the things I want to study is how attributions of blame can determine who is targeted in aggressive behavior. The homicide research would tend to suggest that people tend to target either the partner or the rival as the focus of their aggressive behavior, indicating that it isn't necessarily a blanket sort of anger, that it tends to be focused and concentrated on one of the people within the triad, and who becomes that person and why is something I'm very interested in and have studied a lot. So the evidence would suggest, once again, that people tend to go after either one or the other in the homicide data. Now, some research would suggest that the partner is more often to get targeted in homicide, but if you look a little closer, a lot of that research tends to be focused on people who are pathologically jealous, indicating if you're pathologically jealous, you do tend to target your partner. But if you're not pathologically jealous and you commit murder in the name of jealousy, then it does tend to be roughly evenly split. So people tend to pick one person to focus their anger on when it comes to aggression. And I'm interested in exploring how blame can be determined as a part of this process. So this notion of who tends to be seen as responsible is something that I'm interested in exploring as a researcher, and that I've actually collected some data on as it comes to the connection between blame and jealousy and aggression. So my hypothesis is that the person we blame tends to be the focus of these greater negative feelings, and then ultimately a greater focus of aggression as well. In addition to attributions of blame, there can also be an assumption that the other party in question is hostile or not. So, for example, Dodge in 1980 developed the hostile attribution bias, which indicated that in an ambiguous situation, some people would be more likely to determine that the situation was due to the other party being hostile than others. So what he did was he had boys who had been identified as aggressive read about an ambiguous situation and then determine their response and their feelings about it. And those boys were more likely to make hostile attributions toward the other person. So someone bumps into you and spills your milk, how in the lunchroom, how angry you're going to be, how much are they to blame, and that the boys who were more aggressive were more likely to see hostility in that other person, and that it was somehow an intentional act. So they were more likely to make that attribution than boys who hadn't been identified as aggressive. Teenagers, we've already talked about, teenagers are much more likely to see hostility in neutral faces, and they're spectacularly bad at reading emotions accurately. So teenagers are much more likely to leap to an attribution of hostility just in general, based on what we understand from how they process the emotional expressions of others. So they are far less accurate at identifying others' expressions, and they see that neutral face as more hostile. They assume that you're more hostile, and they're therefore more likely to take preemptive, aggressive action. Other things that can contribute to aggressive tendencies, alcohol is a big one. Alcohol tends to reduce our inhibitions, and we're more likely to, once again, leap to attributing hostility in others when we're under the influence of alcohol. Aggression is far easier when it's a part of a crowd. I talked about lynching earlier and genocide. Acts of mass aggression where there's a group of people committing that act. It tends to be far easier for people to lose themselves in the crowd and to commit acts that they wouldn't commit as individuals. So when you are part of a crowd, you don't have a personal sense of responsibility or identity. You kind of go with the flow. Likewise, when you see the person you're aggressing against as less than a person, it's also far easier to commit aggressive acts. So aggression is easier when you are less likely to perceive that person as a person. So it's interesting to note that our threat reaction tends to be one of overkill as a default setting. So for example, if people are receiving pain and inflicting pain, they tend to, when asked, report that their pain is more intense than the pain that they inflict on other people, even if it's at the same level, if that makes sense. So you get inflicted with a shock, you inflict someone else with a shock at the same level, but you report that your pain is more intense than their pain that you've just given them. People also tend to overestimate how strongly someone else has responded to them, and then tend to overcompensate greater as a result. So our perceptions of our own pain compared to the pain we inflict on others tend to lead to a vicious cycle of one-upsmanship where we try to inflict more and more pain because we perceive that the offense we've received is greater than the offense we've given. So this can lead to a vicious cycle. Oftentimes people can engage in dissonance reduction after overkill. So after overcompensating and being overly vicious towards someone as a reaction to an initial offense, people can often engage in profound self-justification where they might justify their behavior by saying, oh, well, they really deserved it. And they also dislike that person more as a way to justify their overkill response. The greater dissonance there is in terms of how much overkill is present, the greater that individual is derogated, indicating that they have to resolve that dissonance, and the way that they do it easiest is not through changing their actions, which have already happened, but changing their attitudes, which we all know is an easier thing to change. And it justifies their actions by changing their attitudes toward the person they were aggressive towards in a way that was over the top.